Welcome to our series, Books for Better Understanding, with the University of Notre Dame Press. My name is Jacob Kildew, and I'm an editorial assistant here at the Press. I'm pleased to introduce our guests, Professors George Hawley and Jesse Merriam, who will be discussing Professor Hawley's forthcoming book, Conservatism in a Divided America, the Right and Identity Politics. The book will be published by Notre Dame Press and will be released in November of this year. Before I give Professor Merriam the floor, let me briefly introduce each of our guests. Today's featured author is George Hawley, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alabama. His work is broadly focused on American politics, with a special concern for electoral behavior, elections, migration and politics, and the conservative movement in America. His scholarly articles have appeared in various prestigious journals, such as Party Politics, Electoral Studies, and Social Science Quarterly. Professor Hawley is also the author of a number of monographs, including Making Sense of the Alt-Right and Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism. Jesse Merriam is an associate professor of government at Patrick Henry College. He has published his work in places such as Law and Liberty, The American Mind, The American Conservative, and Claremont Review of Books. Professor Merriam has kindly agreed to lead our discussion today. So without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this. I'm very excited. Not only to be involved in just book discussion, but in a discussion of this book in particular. I've been a big fan of Dr. Hawley's work for a very long time. And after reading this book, I have to say this is probably the most interesting book. Right-Wing Critics was a book that really resonated with me. I learned a lot from it. But this book, in a way, is even more provocative. And it's getting us to think about some issues that a lot of us are uncomfortable thinking about. And the first question that really came to my mind as I was reading the book is how our new identity politics, if it is a new identity politics, is different from the older versions. So Dr. Hawley talks about the fact that identity politics was not born necessarily with the new left, which is the conventional narrative that we had a political order where identity was not a significant part of electoral politics. Then you get the new left and various ethnic and sexual grievances that form voting blocks. And then you get identity politics. Well, Dr. Hawley's book is probing that and questioning whether that narrative is true. So I'm curious whether he thinks that what the new left created in terms of identity politics, how it's different from older versions.
Sure. There's a lot there. You're right that I do think that there has been an identity element to U.S. politics going all the way back to the colonial era. I think you can think about sort of the religious politics of the day from even the late 1700s as being, a kind of identity politics. But I also do think it's true to say that identity politics, as we've understood it since, say, the 1970s, is distinct from earlier varieties of what you called grievance politics. You could call sort of the earlier iterations of the feminist movement and the civil rights movement and related movements that were springing up throughout the 20th century. I think that the more recent iterations of identity politics, though, are distinct, and this is not my own original idea. Other scholars have made this argument in that it's taken a much more adversarial approach to, for lack of a better term, we can call the dominant culture. And if we think about the narratives around early feminist movements, around the earlier civil rights movements, there was a push for incorporation of these disadvantaged groups into the mainstream, bourgeois white American society. That is, that the sort of the boundaries of the mainstream need to be expanded to incorporate these other groups who needed to be brought in as equal members, be it women, be it African Americans, be it migrant workers, whoever is the group in question. But I will say that, more recently, I don't think that's been as much the norm. If we think about, say, some of the post-civil rights movement trends we saw in the push for African-American rights, where we see the movement towards sort of Black power or Black is beautiful, and an insistence that these different identity groups should be allowed to continue to exist on their own terms rather than simply be incorporated into the pre-existing mainstream of American life, particularly the mainstream, white Christian middle class American life, and an insistence that actually no, feminists, they should carve out some distinct space for women. Black should not feel the need to, for quote unquote, assimilate into white society, that they should be allowed to to set their culture according to their own terms and be treated as equals nonetheless. So I would say that that is a crucial distinction as we think about the development of identity politics over the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, a second question that's somewhat related. You talk about political identity as a new version of identity politics. And that led me to wonder whether the collapse of state sovereignty, this idea that the federal government and the state governments have different responsibilities, and the regionalization of parties that system created, so that Southern Democrats were different from Northern Democrats and Midwestern Democrats were different from Northern or Northeastern Democrats. How the collapse of that system has kind of intensified identity politics, because now Democrats are the same, whether they're where you are in Alabama or where I am in Maryland. Republicans are the same, whether where you are in Alabama or where I am in Maryland. And whether that unification and centralization of the political order has led to a decline in regional identities and has intensified some of the political identities and racial identities that drive polarization today.
Yeah, what you're talking about is, it seems like just a subset of the bigger phenomenon of the nationalization of politics, that everything is a national issue. Even local issues get treated as national issues. Just to take recent examples, I feel like a lot of the big news stories coming out of the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, seem to be focused in on something that would have been a purely local event that's been turned into a national story that everybody needs to have opinions on, like all the talk about school curriculums. Suddenly a poorly worded decision made by some city council or school district out in the middle of nowhere is suddenly New York Times level news. So I think that sort of the broader nationalization of everything is part of what we're talking about, and why partisanship has become what it has become. But I do think that, the breakdown of regional identities, at least when it comes to politics, is probably also exacerbating this. I do think that federalism, a stronger amount of federalism, could perhaps alleviate some of these problems, though I'm sensitive to those who would say that potentially it could make some of them worse. But I do think that you're right, that the kind of nationalization of politics, I think, is strengthening party identities. And the stronger party identities become, the more party politics or just partisan politics can come to resemble identity politics under another name. The way I describe it in the book is that to a large degree, people are kind of laundering these other types of identities through party politics, where there's at least a certain degree of plausible deniability that you are pursuing something other than purely identity-based interests and concerns.
Yeah, it would seem that a stronger, more robust federalism would at least mitigate some of these problems. But I imagine that someone who is in favor of centralization would point to Federalist 10 and say, well, the extended republic was designed to create competing factions, and that created a kind of cohesive union where the factions are playing out with one another at a national level. Do you think the same argument could be applied to identity politics, that the greater the number of people, the more extended the republic in Madison's terms, you'll have more competition among these various ethnic groups? So a single one will not be able to capture local governance the way that it would under a federalist scheme.
Yeah, I think that that's true. Obviously, Madison in Federalist 10, as he was discussing factions, his focus was on particular material interests, the unequal distribution of property, the fact that certain economic interests will prefer different types of public policies. But I don't really see why that same framework couldn't be applied from an identity-based perspective. That is, rather than thinking about manufacturing versus agricultural interests, we could be thinking about different ethnic, racial, or religious interests. And there is I think, a case to be made that as the country becomes more diverse, the likelihood of any single one group dominating all the others becomes less likely. There are a couple of things I think holding that position back, though. One is the fact that we appear to be stuck with a two-party system in the indefinite future, which means that politics remains a kind of dichotomous choice. Whereas if we had a multi-party system where we had different groups that were catering to more narrow, more specific interests, we might see a little bit more horse trading and political alliances that were more contingent rather than set in stone based on party ID. But even so, I think that kind of the simplistic view that a lot of proponents of identity politics and opponents, for that matter, take towards the way politics is going to play out over the next couple of decades, I'm not quite sure that they're right. There's this idea, and this is promoted on both parts of the left and the right, that we've got these two broad coalitions. You have, I guess you could call, from the left's perspective, they'd call it the legacy of white colonial, heteronormative Christian nationalist, right, and then you kind of have a broad, this is kind of an anachronistic term, but they used to call the rainbow coalition of all the different ethnic, sexual, racial, religious minorities who will all sort of combine into a defensive bloc, and eventually change America entirely, and usher in this new and better future. I'm not quite sure that that's a realistic view of what things are going to look like in the future. I'm not so convinced that all of these different groups that they have in common the fact that they're minorities, and they have in common that they all have different grievances. I'm not sure that that is enough to keep them as a united front indefinitely. I think that the coalition of all these different minority groups might be less stable than it first appears, especially if you're looking at it from the perspective of certain places on the right. And we're starting to see little bits of this come about. For example, obviously we have the case of certain Hispanic communities, not all of them, but a move towards the Republican Party in places like South Texas in recent election cycles, which suggests that at least elements of the Hispanic population in the US is not committed to the Democratic Party indefinitely. And if we think about specific interests, we have that case of California a couple of years back where there was the vote on affirmative action, and it was largely, or at least to some extent, it was Asian voters who were responsible for keeping affirmative action from returning to California. So the idea that all of these groups are going to, remain united on pushing a particular progressive agenda, I think, is unlikely. And as diversity turns the country into something other than sort of a white versus black, or Catholic versus Protestant, or Gentile versus Jew type of identity politics, and becomes a much bigger kind of mishmash of these very different groups, then I think that we'll see identity politics become more complex, but also perhaps less dangerous than a lot of people think it will be in the decades ahead.
I guess it's possible, though, it could become more dangerous, because I imagine, with the California example, that some issues will be off the table as a result of these alliances. So affirmative action is one, maybe reparations would be another. But there still could be, through the alliance, the use of identity politics to create a common enemy, which could actually create a very divisive and dangerous politics. So if this, what you call it, a rainbow coalition, means that some things where the groups have different interests on, like affirmative action, means those things are off the table. That may drive them toward kind of a common enemy that will then be the basis for the politics. Do you see that as a likelihood or possibility?
It's conceivable, and I think that is very much true for especially like the activist class. The degree to which when a type of activist on either side gets frustrated, there tends to be a turn towards very almost apocalyptic Manichaean thinking. Whether that will trickle down and become the norm everywhere within the electorate, I think that remains to be seen. Obviously, there's still a lot of anger in politics, and the anger surrounding partisan politics actually seems to be getting worse. But I'm not sure that I'm convinced that it's that the scenario that you describe is entirely plausible, or if it does happen, that it will be as disastrous as it sounds. Perhaps it would actually be the end result might not be that much worse than what we have today.
Well, I guess you could see hints of this in the way that some of the crime against Asian Americans, how those crimes were treated in the mainstream media over the past couple of years. Critical race theory itself, the way it's taught, to public school students, tends to focus on the good groups who are part of this coalition, and then the one bad group. It does seem like this simplified Manichaean version of identity politics. So taking away the stuff where the groups are divided and kind of highlighting and intensifying the issues on which they may coalesce. Does that seem to fit with the way that this identity politics coalition may play out?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that. I'm just not sure if it will be stable in the long run. I think that the interests of different groups, are not as aligned as they're sometimes presented as. These different groups, they have different economic interests. And sometimes different cultural interests, right? Because some identity groups, their grievances are based more on issues of cultural recognition than on political economy. And then we have others where, economics is the primary factor. And then you have others where it's a mix of the economic and of the cultural. And that being the case, I don't know that, all of these different groups are really going to, remain, aligned in the long term. Is a group that is fighting for, expanded rights for, say, immigrants necessarily, and always going to care about the interests of the transgender. Maybe that coalition will remain stable for the long run, and that all these different progressive groups will effectively stand together and support each other's interests. Or maybe not. And similarly on the right, it's done a pretty good job of keeping a coalition of these different interests, these different groups that have different things that they care about, keeping them within the same party. But are they doing a particularly good job of standing together on all these separate issues? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So I'll just be watching it with interest, let's say. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play out.
Let's say the identity politics, the entire framework does run out of steam through the diversification of America and these disparate interests, coming to the surface. What happens next, do you think? So I imagine the average conservative would think that there would be kind of a new politics that would come out of it that would be multiracial and colorblind. Are you as optimistic as that narrative generally holds?
No, I'm not that optimistic. Anybody who is proposing a kind of sunny scenario in which politics stops being so contentious, identity stops being such a crucial element of politics, I think that's unlikely. I think that there's going to be kind of an identity element that will be permanently baked into partisan politics. I think that's just part of human psychology. But I think that the relationships and the boundaries of different group identities, I think, can and do shift over time. and the simplistic idea that it's going to be forever the white Christian middle class male versus everyone else. And then once, the other groups become sufficiently large, then suddenly the new, progressive utopia will arrive. I think that is naive, and people who are either afraid of it or really cheering it on are going to see that that's probably not the way it's ultimately going to work out. I think we're going to see just over time, shifts of coalitions, but I think the emotions are going to remain high. And I think that politics is going to remain, regardless of how this plays out, a rather unpleasant vocation for the foreseeable future.
It seems to me that the only way out of that is for a new identity to become more powerful than the racial, ethnic, and sexual identities that we have now. And I mentioned it, I started our conversation with regional identities. And that doesn't seem to be on the table, because once you lose a regional identity, once you lose a Southern identity or a Midwestern identity, and you just become American or a Democrat or Republican, it's hard to restore it, right? And then with commercialization and globalization, this is something that just is from a different era. We're not going to be able to get our regional identities back. So is there anything that could compete with the very sticky kind of ethnic, racial, and sexual identities that we're moored to right now?
Something that could overrule these other ones. I mean, we hear a lot of conservatives saying that this is actually the project of the new nationalism that you're seeing promoted by people like Yoram Hazony and the so-called national conservatives. Whether it will work, I don't know, because that their message and their agenda is so deeply connected to the conservative movement and thus the Republican Party, that it doesn't offer much of that what's new, something new and appealing to groups that are not already aligned with that. There's some token economic, arguments they're making about, trade or what have you. But I don't know that this new effort to create a powerful national identity that will transcend these other groups, I'm not sure how successful that will be. And you're right about the regional identity thing. I think we can overstate the degree to which geographic mobility is the norm in the United States, but it is the norm among elites, the elites who are going to be setting the tone for American politics. The notion that, people are going to stay in their town for all time, that applies to a lot of people, but not to the ones who are really in charge and who are, setting the tone culturally. So I think regionalism is probably a dead end. I mean, it's not a bad thing. I actually would encourage more of it to the extent that it's possible, but I don't see it as a panacea. So I guess my answer is I don't see what new identity is going to overrule all of these others, which again makes me think that perhaps the Madisonian perspective is the one that is most likely to be efficacious. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, the only, limitation that I see with the extended republic analogy is that, as you mentioned, when Madison was writing, he's talking about economic interests, and there's, mutability, there's change in terms of economic interests. You're not born a farmer. I mean, to some extent, in Madison's time, you were, but there was change in the course of one's lifetime. Whereas we have a much stickier set of interests, in that they're not just, I'm interested in manufacturing interests or agrarian interests. I am this, I am that. And I think that, and there's a historical element too. So some groups have been posited against one another historically. So you can't just strike a new coalition between manufacturing and agrarian interests in a particular region, because now you have, I am this and you are that, and we have been positioned against one another for a long time. So yeah, I am not so optimistic about the extended republic analogy applying to identity politics. But I have a related question, which is, the rise of identity politics came at the same time as the rise in secularism and the demise of Christianity. So if regionalization is not part of the answer, and I think we can both say that regrettably, do you see Christianity and the restoration of Christianity as part of the answer? So white Americans and Black Americans have disagreed on a lot of things and have a very complicated and troubled history, but they have shared to a significant extent a religious heritage. So do you see this as a way out?
Potentially. I mean, this is a subject that has been brought up by a lot of popular writers, thinking about that, arguing that the decline of religion is removing what once was a very powerful adhesive for society, keeping different groups. For all our differences, we all still had that. And I would think that there's a certain truth to that, especially as we think about the more effective arguments made during the civil rights era, where there was the argument that that was being made from a specific Christian perspective. I think the fact that Martin Luther King was a preacher, I think, did help him build inroads with white Americans in a way that, if that had not been the case, I think it would have been more challenging, and that there was this common moral framework that all of these different groups were able to appeal to, and a similar kind of moral authority that everyone recognized. I guess my two responses to that would be, over the long course of American history, we can say that the religion has been, sometimes unifying and sometimes very divisive. If we think about, people will say, oh, we were once a universally Protestant nation. Yes, but the different Protestant groups were not especially, aligned with each other. It's not as though the fact that both Puritans and Quakers and Anglicans and later Episcopalians, the fact that they were all Protestant, didn't really seem to matter that much to them when it came to their disagreements with each other. To take the more contemporary counter argument, though, I took very seriously the argument made by people like Ross Douthat and others that, oh, you think that the religious right was bad, wait until you see the post-religious right, because the religious right, well, it also had they had a certain amount of egalitarianism that was baked right into it. That was inescapable based on different, almost any interpretation of the Gospels, for example. And I thought, oh, that's actually an interesting and perhaps compelling argument, but I am not really finding much evidence for that in the quantitative data in terms of what people actually believe and how it correlates to their religious identities. That is the idea that the secular are going to be more attracted to different kinds of identity politics than the religious, or that the religious are going to be more tolerant than the secular on these other measures. I'm just not seeing it. So there was this idea that the decline of the religious right would lead to a spike in support for the racial right, and at least at the individual level, perhaps if we were trying to measure it some other way, we'll see things differently. But at the individual level, I'm just not finding that secularists are more likely to turn to say a racial or ethnic or sexual identity to be sort of the foundation of their personal identity and the source of their political beliefs. So I tend to think of secularism and these kind of identity issues as being, kind of tangentially related, but I wouldn't draw a straight line from one to the other.
So region isn't going to save us, and at least empirically speaking, you don't see evidence of a restored Christianity, or at least some sort of common faith, as saving us from identity politics.
Well, even if I did, then it asks the question, okay, how do you stop the secularizing trends? Which I've yet to hear anyone making compelling arguments like, oh, if you implement these changes, then the churches are going to start filling up again. So even if I did think that, a Christian revival was the solution, I don't really see much evidence of a Christian revival on the horizon anyway. So in a sense, it might be kind of a moot point.
And so it seems to me that there are three possibilities. We've talked about region, we've talked about religion. What about economics? Do you see some sort of economic policy as, again, not solving the identity problem, but at least mitigating it?
Well, I mean, there's a case to be made. I mean, most proponents of identity politics will say that, even though identity is a key issue, the material concerns are still at the foundation of what they're trying to get at. It isn't all about cultural recognition. It's also, we want, more economic resources for ourselves and for our allies. And so in that sense, a new era of widespread and widely shared economic prosperity, I think probably would mitigate this a little bit if the number of people in, especially the degree to which economic resources are not identical across different groups, if we can start seeing, greater levels of economic parity, higher levels of economic growth, I think that probably would take some of the dangers away. If everybody feels like they have a lot of economic interests vested in the system as it currently exists. I don't think that would solve everything, though, because I think there is still an element of identity politics that is purely about cultural recognition rather than wanting to gain more economic resources or gain higher levels of wealth and lower unemployment or whatnot for your specific group. So I think that would be definitely solve some issues, but not all of them.
So it seemed that a party that was attentive to small town America, that was not outright, Christian perhaps, but more religiously oriented and concerned about the restoration of Christianity and more economically populist would be the best way of dealing with identity politics. Do you agree with that? And do you see that as being part of either party platform?
Well, economic populism, I think, can be, I hate this term, but I can't think of a better one off the top of my head, a kind of double-edged sword, right? I mean, yes, presumably it would lead to, greater levels of economic redistribution, which is what a lot of proponents of identity politics are directly calling for. But if it's at the expense of economic dynamism and economic growth, that ultimately leads, I mean, this is sounding like a very anachronistic, type of discussion about the politics of economics. But if populist policies hurt the economy overall, even if it does lead to a greater level of, potential equality, because I'm not sure that will ultimately be beneficial. It might just lead to calls for yet more economic populism and redistribution, and it becomes a kind of unfortunate negative spiral. So in some degrees, I think this is a viable idea, but I think we need to be very careful and think about what the economic consequences of such a pursuit would be. In terms of whether or not the government should be more attentive to things like small town America, the problem with that is that's being attentive to, the parts of America that are in the decline in terms of population. Most people do not live in small towns anymore. But I think if you're talking more broadly about, more attentive to specific regional identities, I think that's reasonable. But the trend towards nationalization, I think that it's not purely political. I think it's also media, and by media I mean not just news media, but just popular media, and where everybody kind of consumes the same types of entertainment, is following the same national news stories. I think all of these things are causing regional identities to become weaker and weaker, and I'm not quite sure how politics can solve that problem.
All right, and then the last question that I had, this is just something that I get from reading commentary on identity politics. There are a lot of comparisons between Marxism as an economic theory and the way that identity politics are playing out. And oftentimes Black Lives Matter and groups like that are accused of being inherently Marxist. I was just interested to what extent you think that is an accurate depiction of how these groups operate.
I don't think it's accurate. If I think about the organizations pushing for, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Do I see a strong connection between their agenda and, say, Marx's capital? Like, not really. I think that the Marxist term, which is usually used as a pejorative, is just kind of a holdover from, long-term conservative talking points going back to the Cold War, if not before, that the bad guys are communists. And so I think this is just a revival of a very old form of argumentation. I think, you know, there are connections between Marxism and much of the contemporary left just because, you know, the genealogy is there. But would Marx recognize BLM and say, okay, this is a movement that is clearly pushing for what I was talking about back in the 19th century? I don't think so. That's at least not how I interpret what Marx was writing about. But, you know, Marx had said a lot of things that, you know, history didn't quite vindicate. I mean, you know, if you want to be a true Marxist, does that mean that you have to subscribe to, say, some strange theory of value that modern economics seems to have debunked? So I guess it's a question of, you know, how broadly are you willing to, you know, draw the category of Marxism? And I think if you draw broadly enough, then sure, you can say that modern identity politics practitioners are the descendants of Marx. But if you're inclined to read Marx a little bit more narrowly than as I am, I would say that there is a pretty strong distinction between the two.
The last point on this, so I imagine that the adherents to this theory wouldn't say that Marx necessarily would recognize Black Lives Matter as furthering his agenda. But if he were alive today, and he would understand that race or identity can be a vehicle for achieving the goals that he wants in terms of deconstructing economic relations and changing power hierarchies. Do you see it as Marxist in that sense? I mean, critical race theory did emerge out of critical legal studies, which was an openly Marxist paradigm in terms of deconstructing power relations and hierarchies. Do you see it as Marxist in that sense?
I mean, I see it as, I guess so. I mean, if we're going to say that, you know, if we look at the Marxist project as, you know, deconstructing, you know, sort of bourgeois norms, especially if we think about kind of post-Marxists like, say, Gramsci, then I think that we can see a stronger connection. So if we're going to be thinking about not just necessarily Marx himself, but about, you know, his subsequent disciples over the following century, then yeah, I think you can you can say that, you know, the genealogy of modern identity politics can be traced at least partially to Marx. But I think that's true of almost the entirety of the left, just because of the long shadow that Marx cast. So I guess this is a question that will depend on your perspective, I suppose, and you know, what properly represented Marx and what does not is one that I think is inherently subjective. So I'm not going to, you know, argue the point of somebody who can say, well, if you take, you know, these 5 steps from Marxism, you can see how it leads to this current paradigm. I'm just not convinced that, you know, had Marx never existed, would we see a very different type of identity politics? I'm not sure that we would.
Yeah, and your book makes the helpful point, something I wasn't entirely attuned to, that conservative commentary on the civil rights movement, something I've followed pretty closely, that used a lot of communist association. So there's the famous Richard Weaver article, but there were a lot of other instances that you mentioned in the book in which conservatives, like at National Review, were relying on these simplistic associations between what the Communist Project represented and what the Civil Rights Movement represented. So this is a part, in other words, of kind of conservative discourse to associate things with the Communist Project, whether they're directly related or not.
Yeah, and that was, you know, in part of it, it was sincere, right? The first generation of post-war conservatives was genuinely terrified of communism. Like, they really did think that a worldwide communist revolution was likely. And for people like Burnham and Chambers, they thought it was probable and almost a foregone conclusion. On the other hand, I also think that the connection that they were drawing between civil rights and communism was in part due to an unwillingness to attack the civil rights movement on the main question. They didn't want to alienate Southern supporters. They didn't want to come out and say that segregation was good, but they also seemed to have at least a little bit of discomfort defending segregation and Jim Crow and just racial mores as such. So the easier solution for them was to, change the subject and say, well, let's notice that some of Martin Luther King's advisors have connections to communism. I think that there's a kind of cynical element to it as well, of trying to change the grounds of the debate to areas where they felt more comfortable.
Very interesting. Well, as usual, you've enlightened me, also made me a little bit more pessimistic about the state of our politics. Do you have any optimism in terms of identity politics? I mean, you see it as kind of an ongoing feature. But
no, I'm very allergic to alarmism. I think anybody who's read my earlier stuff would probably agree. Some of my critics have said that I'm insufficiently alarmist on a lot of points. And I think that, things could have turned out a lot worse than they have so far. And I think that, as a society, I think it's more likely than not, we're going to figure out a way to muddle through, some of the more, apocalyptic voices you hear, talking about, oh, we're going to have secession and so get civil war and the fabric of society is breaking apart. I think that is, people who think that are probably spending too much time on the internet. And in the real world, people are still for the most part kind of muddling through and getting by and getting along with their neighbors more or less okay. I think that identity politics, as we understand it, is a very serious challenge. And we should take the complaints of its practitioners seriously, while also recognizing the potential problems it creates, without taking it for granted that we are on some very dangerous road that's going to necessarily lead to disaster, because that's not what I see in my interactions with the world.
Well, I have you on this point, and really the last point. Do you think that the alarmism is driven by the fact that identity politics, if you look at it in the 1970s, almost seemed harmless in the sense that you had relatively small groups in isolated parts of the country demanding certain types of recognition, and it wasn't going to break the country to give them that. So as perhaps frightening as the Black Power movement may have been to some people, or the feminist movement, these were relatively insular and isolated movements. With the kind of demographic transformation of the country, do you think that identity politics all of a sudden takes on a more alarming quality? So now you have not just feminism, but you have gay rights and transgender rights. It's entered public school curriculum, and it's not just Black rights, it's immigrant rights. And then there's, of course, the very soon kind of loss of an ethnic majority. Do you think that alarmism is driven by the complexity of our new identity politics?
It could be. I mean, that's one explanation. Other might be that alarmism is kind of the norm. If you go back and read what people were writing, even in seemingly placid times like the 1990s, there's always been a kind of an apocalyptic approach to U.S. politics. This has been especially true on the right, but I guess you could see it on the left as well. Everything is always getting worse and worse. I mean, if you look at the way a lot of the left on Twitter is talking right now, you'd think that the world is about to come to an end based on these victories that conservatives have won in the Supreme Court. So I think that there's more than enough alarmism to go around, and I'm not sure that it's always connected to realistic concerns. That said, is identity politics potentially more dangerous now than it was several decades ago, as we become an increasingly heterogeneous society? Maybe, but on the other hand, maybe less so if the Madisonian perspective does apply to the question of identity, which I think it's a useful hypothesis. It's going to be worth watching in the future. I wish I could be totally confident that that's how that's going to work out, but I think it remains to be seen.
All right, well, thank you very much. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you both for this excellent conversation. It's been a pleasure to sit in on. I wonder if either of you have any just final comments before we close on why this book matters or why our audience should come and read your book.
Oh, gracious. Well, I hope that people find that I bring a new perspective to a contentious issue, and I try my best to maintain a dispassionate tone that I hope will be that people across the political spectrum will find appealing. I'm really not trying to score, partisan or ideological points here. I mean, there's no such thing as true objectivity, but I'm hopeful that I, reported everything as accurately and honestly as possible, and that people will find that to be the case, and hopefully, learn something interesting from the end result.
Excellent. Great. Well, I want to thank both of you, George Hawley and Jesse Merriam, for being with us today to discuss Professor Hawley's upcoming book, Conservatism in a Divided America. The book is available for pre-order and will be released in November of this year. You can order Professor Hawley's book through our website at undpress.nd.edu or wherever books are sold. Thank you all for joining us in this installment of our series, Books for Better Understanding. And thank you again, George and Jesse, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.